Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing the last reviews of my Booker Prize reading this year ahead of the shortlist, which is going to be announced pretty shortly. And let's not waste any time and get straight into the first book for today, which is One Boat by Jonathan Buckley, notably Fitzcarraldo Edition's first ever nomination for the main English language Booker, which is very exciting for everyone because they're a press that has been very much in focus for the International Booker for a long time, and it's cool to see them get recognised by the sister prize of that. Unfortunately though, this is going to be a bad review, and by that I don't really mean a negative review, though it is that as well. I mean a review of quite poor quality, because the truth is I just didn't get very much out of this book, and I don't feel like I have an awful lot to say about it. So this novel is about a woman called Teresa who travels to a Greek island after the death of her father, and this is the same island that she visited 9 years earlier when her mother died, and it becomes a sort of stage for her grief. This is a second showing. The first time that she visited, she had chosen the town based on a certain set of criteria. It was by the sea, it was a small town with a public square, a cafe where she could sit and reflect and people watch. She was acting almost like a location scout for a movie. And now she returns and she re-encounters some of the same inhabitants and forms new conversations with them. And in amongst that, she sort of tells us about what happened the first time around. Some of these encounters and conversations touch on really big ideas, theories of justice and time, the ways that we interpret the universe. And there's a thematic thread about performance here for sure, like the roles we assign ourselves, the performance of our grief, even the performance of normality, and that all kind of resonates with Greece as the location for the novel because it's the home of theatre and tragedy. And the writing can very often be beautiful in this book. There were plenty of sentences where I stopped and thought about them. There was one that sticks out to me, which was her mother was showing her the universe when she was a child, like showing her the stars, and she likened trying to describe it as like trying to understand music just by hearing a description of music and not the music itself. And that made me really like stop in my tracks and think, and I thought that was really beautiful. The atmosphere of the island is also like really serviceably evoked. I don't think it wasn't like, oh, the island itself was a character, as you sometimes get with these sort of location heavy narratives, but it was like nicely done. Beyond that though, I just found it a bit boring. It was so quotidian, so navel-gazing. We read a lot of fragments of Teresa's journal entries from both visits, these scraps of thoughts, and we get scenes from dreams. I really beg authors to stop including dream sequences because it's boring in real life, it's boring on the page. But this book ends up feeling a bit like a metafictional companion piece to a novel that might have been much more compelling. At the very end, it actually does take a swing at metafiction, which I suspect is what caught the judge's attention. And intellectually, that's interesting, like refracting the theme of performance back onto the book itself, making us aware of how like both author and reader are always interpreting things through our own lenses. But for me, it kind of weakened the novel actually, because it retroactively made all of these characters feel like characters rather than real people. I also didn't really care for Teresa as a protagonist, and I think the decision of Buckley to write from a woman's perspective, he didn't quite pull it off. Like, I don't think authors should be limited to writing only from their own identity or experience, but something about the execution here just didn't quite work for me. I kept lapsing into feeling like the main character was a man. I can't put my finger on exactly why, because it definitely wasn't a case of men writing women badly or anything. There were no like excessive discussions of her boobs and how they felt. But I think there was just some masculine energy about the voice, and I frequently kept having to remind myself that I was reading a woman character. So while there are some intriguing ideas and occasional flashes of beauty, overall this book just didn't really work for me, I'm sad to say. Then we've got another novel about performance, which is Audition by Katie Kitamura, and I've got two caveats up front. So first, I read this quite a while ago and I didn't take any notes because it was while I was on my break. So this is not going to be my sharpest review. And then second, I will try to avoid spoilers, but if you are someone who is completely spoiler averse, you may want to skip ahead. The premise for this one is pretty simple. An actress arrives at a restaurant to have lunch with a younger man. We don't know why she's there or what their relationship is, and naturally, your mind leaps to something sexual. And this book does have like the vibe of a sexually charged thriller, something a bit like the movie May December, which also centres an actress and looks at a relationship with a young man. But it isn't that, because instead the young man has read some stuff about this actress in an interview she gave to a magazine or a newspaper, and he makes a claim that feels just completely impossible to her. We read this conversation and how it plays out, and then the actress returns to the theatre where she is rehearsing for a play, and we see her struggle with certain scenes, particularly this pivotal one at the midpoint. But the young man lingers in her orbit because he happens to be interning with someone connected to the production. We also get a glimpse of her home life. She's in a seemingly happy marriage. She has a loving morning routine filled with these fresh pastries from a bakery downstairs. But there's also a tinge of sadness because there is like an unfulfilled desire for children that her husband has. And then part one ends and part two begins, and the relationship between the young man and the actress has shifted dramatically. It is destabilising and disorienting as a reader. Kitamura essentially gives us a puzzle, like, has something really changed? Was there something always true that we weren't privy to at the start? Or are we looking at some sort of sliding doors scenario? I think it's a bold, unapologetic move by the author, and I found it a lot of fun to unpick and play with. But it also becomes deeply uncomfortable. Like, the second part grows more and more unsettling the longer that it goes on. What makes it especially fascinating is how it kind of mirrors the play that the actress is rehearsing. She describes that midpoint scene that she's struggling with as carrying the burden of making the entire second act believable. Like, if that doesn't work, the whole play collapses. And in Audition, Kitamura essentially omits that crucial scene. She like doesn't give us that fulcrum in the middle of the story, and she leaves us to deal with the jarring jump for ourselves. It's a really big gamble, but I think it's a really clever one. Thematically, the book's about family as performance, about the roles we're expected to play, and it does edge into darker territory. This metaphor of children as parasites turns into something more literal. There's a fear of being infiltrated or losing control. Those undertones again give it the texture of like a creepy A24 art house movie. And it's a book that's compelling not just structurally and thematically, but also at the sentence level too. The prose is very beautiful, it's very precise. There is a leanness to it that I really appreciated. And it's a short novel, but one that's really expansive in ideas. Not a word feels wasted here. I found it disorienting, disturbing, and very deeply impressive. Definitely one to discuss in a very spoilerific way with other people that have read it, because there's a lot to chew on here. Okay, next up for review is Endling by Maria Reva. This is actually another novel that you might want to read without too much foreknowledge, so if you would prefer to go into that blind, you may want to skip ahead. This review too, I don't know why all of these reviews at the start of each one I'm like, well, this one's shit, this review's not worth watching, I might as well have not made the video. But anyway, this is a book that centres on a woman called Reva, a Ukrainian malacologist, which is a scientist devoted to the study of snails, and she spends her days driving a mobile laboratory across the country attempting to save species of snail threatened with extinction. But you may be surprised to know that that is not work that pays the bills, and so to supplement her income, she also works with a company called Romeo Meets Julia, attending romance tourism events where rich Western men come to meet Ukrainian women and try to find a wife. She actually has no interest in this herself, and there is an asexuality subplot in here that I think is handled quite well. But Reva is content just being there to make up the numbers. She is the hay in which these men try to find their needle. At one of these events, she encounters a young woman who has an activist mother who has disappeared, and this young woman has a proposal. She wants to hire Reva's van, as she just sees it, which is actually her laboratory, in order to abduct a group of these tourists to frighten off others that might come and basically collapse the whole industry. Reva finds herself really tempted by this, not least because she is at something of a professional and personal dead end herself. She only has one snail left in her care, this last of a kind specimen whose shell curls the other way. I don't know what the right way is, but it curls the other way to what it normally would, and she affectionately has named it Lefty. All of this takes place around Valentine's Day in 2022, which is just days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And here's where it gets interesting, because what could be the novel's inciting crisis for the characters instead becomes a crisis for the novel itself. The narrative completely breaks down as Reva inserts herself into the book and interrogates the very act of writing it. Like, what does it mean to write about Ukraine at this time? What is the point? Can she make jokes? And if so, who gives her permission to do so or not? And who does her writing need to be palatable to? And further than that, she wonders, what right does she have, as someone living in Canada, to write about events experienced so much more viscerally by those who have stayed behind? It's a diversion that is very bold, and I really admired its ambition. Some of the metafictional touches continue throughout the novel, and they are affecting. There are scenes where Reva is essentially imagining her own circumstances and her own family members into the novel, trying to rewrite their choices. She gives herself do-overs that are not really possible in real life, and I thought these passages had some real poignancy. I also really enjoyed the scientific aspects of the book, though I did find myself wishing there had been more of it. It's very strong at the start and it's very intelligently written, and then it kind of falls away, not completely, but it's really not the focus of the book any longer. The snails become a bit of a metaphor for the fragile remnants of stability in our society, or in a collapsing society. They are slow and vulnerable, unwilling to save themselves, and they exhaust the people who try to protect them. It's an image that really works, even if it comes at the expense of the, I guess, more realist science that I was really enjoying. But I have to admit, in other respects, the book kind of lost me. It has this whimsical tone that I don't really jive with, and its attempts at humour didn't land. I do think humour on the page is a delicate business. It really depends on the reader's sensibility, and for me this simply wasn't very funny. The balance between the metafictional and the fictional strands didn't quite work either. Once the book returns to its fictional story, I guess the artifice of the characters kind of more brightly shines through the veneer, and suddenly they felt to me more like caricatures or mouthpieces for ideas rather than fully realised people. There's also some parts of that metafiction that I just don't think worked well. She invokes George Saunders and things that he said about the art of writing a novel. I think it's something like a novel being a series of connected yurts. And then for some reason, she puts in fictional conversations with yurt builders in a way that is kind of Saunders-esque, but it felt like a poor imitation, and I just didn't think it made much sense. The trade-off, I guess, is pretty clear. The metafiction allows Reva to grapple explicitly with these really difficult questions, and it shows that she is self-aware, but I think it leaves the narrative elements of the book diminished, and their emotional heft was reduced for me. I think she could have trusted the fictional world itself to do more of that work and let the reader draw those conclusions without that guiding authorial hand. But had she done that, I don't think we necessarily would have seen this book on the long list, because I'm not sure what would set it apart. I had such high hopes for this book, and I know a lot of you watching have already told me how much you loved it. I wanted to love it too, and perhaps it was just a victim of its own reputation, a victim of my expectations for it. Sadly, in the end, I found it just fine. But saying that, I would not be surprised to see this on the shortlist, because I think it has got a lot going for it. Okay, we've got one more book to go. And the last one that I'm going to review is Flashlight by Susan Choi. This is Choi's first novel since winning the National Book Award with Trust Exercise in 2019, and it follows a multiracial family across Japan and the US, spanning decades of history and several generations. The novel opens with a father, Sok, and his daughter Louisa walking along the shore, and that walk ends in tragedy because Louisa is found washed up, alive but barely, while Sok, who never learned to swim, is missing, presumed drowned. This opening chapter is excellent. It is a lyrical, poetic account of the tragedy, paired with a brilliantly observed sequence of Louisa in therapy after she starts acting out and stealing things at school. Choi captures the mind of a girl on the cusp of adolescence, but also traumatised by losing her father so incredibly sharply. From there, the book moves between the different family members, and we go back to Sok's childhood in Japan, his precociousness at school, and the burden that he carried for his family, who are originally from the Korean island of Jeju, but ended up in Japan. This strand of the book offers a really fascinating history, the experiences of Koreans who migrated to Japan under its imperial rule, and their children born in Japan but treated as outsiders, and the complex choices that they faced after World War II. So Korea was their homeland, but some had never set foot there. So when it achieved independence after the war, they faced some really tough choices. They could go back to somewhere they may feel more welcome, but where living standards at that time were lower. And then came the partition of Korea and the devastation of the Korean War, which further complicated things because they were going back to two countries that didn't exist when they left, North Korea or South Korea. Sok's identity is shown as porous and unmoored. He never fits neatly into any national or ethnic categories. Even his name reflects that drift. So he starts out at the beginning of the book with a Japanese name for assimilation. Then he has his Korean name to honour his family's wishes. And then he ends up with this strange anglicised version of it in the US, where he also teaches his wife the incorrect pronunciation of his surname, Kang, pronouncing it Kang, like bang. We also follow his wife, Anne. She's a white American who has her own traumatic past. She was manipulated into giving up a baby when she was young and later raising Louisa with Sok. In the first chapter, we see that Anne is using a wheelchair, and the novel very sensitively depicts how that comes about and how it affects her experience of motherhood and love and marriage. Although the story starts when the parents are young, it spans well into Louisa's adulthood when she becomes a mother herself. The book A Long List this year has no shortage of unlikable characters, but I think these might be the least likeable of all. Sok is angry, distant, he has old-fashioned expectations of marriage and is consumed by this unprocessed fury. Anne is maybe more sympathetic, but still often frustrating, and she's thorny to those who want to help her. And Louisa, scarred by her trauma, I guess, often treats her mother absolutely appallingly, and often in ways that are openly ableist, and it is quite uncomfortable to read at times. But that said, they are all so well written, and their flaws end up giving them real psychological depth, so that their actions are consistent even when they are maddening. There is one more far-fetched character, but even he felt fully realised to me by the end. I especially liked the subtle ways in which traits carried through generations. So Louisa early on mocks her parents' hopelessness at travel, only to later have her own disastrous trip to Europe. And these echoes, they're never pointed out, you just notice them if you're paying attention. I really liked that. Some of the plot points I think do stretch plausibility, but I felt it was always very well earned by Susan Choi. She lines up the chess pieces so carefully so that when there are coincidences, they feel more orchestrated than contrived. This book has a lot, I think, in common with a great short story collection or a novel in stories. Each chapter really stands on its own, has a great storytelling arc, and it helps that Choi is just really great at writing a killer last paragraph. Every chapter in this book comes to a satisfying conclusion, and you feel like you've really learned something worthwhile about the characters, or the plot has unfolded in a very meaningful way, sometimes with a bombshell, sometimes more gently and quietly, but always brilliantly. The final 100 pages, I think, are particularly strong. They are full of revelation before settling into something more heartfelt and heartbreaking. There was a risk that because the characters are so damaged and unlikable, that you might not feel as much empathy for them, but it is done so well, and I was very moved. So overall, I think this is an excellent family novel. It is deeply rooted in history, deftly structured, and told with a very apparent mastery of the craft of storytelling. I absolutely loved it, and I'd highly recommend it. So that was my final review for this year's Booker, and if you have been watching my channel for a little while, you may have done the maths and realised that I've only reviewed 12 of the books. I could have a very good reason for that, because The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny is not out until after the shortlist is announced. But I do have a copy, and I have made a start on it. I'm like 150 pages or so. No, 130 pages in. But I decided while I was reading it that I was rushing too much to try and get all of the books read before the shortlist stage, and that is just not a good way to enjoy this book. It is very dense, there is a lot of detail, it requires the reader to just take their time with it. Doesn't mean it's not readable, it definitely is. I just wanted to slow down and maybe read a few other things at the same time while I chip away at this absolute behemoth of a book. So I may likely review this in the future, but sadly not before the shortlist is announced. I will be back before the shortlist announcement to share my ranking of all the books that I have read and put together my personal shortlist. So I'm really excited for that. I hope you are as well. But yeah, I would love to hear from you down in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. And if you'd like to see more from me, then hit subscribe. But until next time, toodles.